Iran asked for talks. Within hours, the United States answered with 90 separate military targets hit along an entire coastline. That's not a metaphor. That's literally what happened, and tonight I want to walk you through exactly how a request for diplomacy turned into one of the most aggressive coastal bombing campaigns of this entire war. Let's start with the exact sequence, because the timing here matters enormously. In mid-June, the United States and Iran had signed a memorandum of understanding calling for an immediate end to hostilities on every front, including in Lebanon. That ceasefire held shakily for a few weeks. Then, in early July, Iranian strikes hit several commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, including Qatari and Saudi tankers. The United States responded by hitting Iranian sites, and Iran answered back by striking American military installations in Kuwait and Bahrain. By Friday, July 10th, according to reporting from NBC News, President Trump posted directly on Truth Social that Iran had asked the United States to continue talks, and that the U.S. had agreed to do so, but with one very specific condition attached. In his own words, the United States told Iran, in no uncertain terms, that the ceasefire was over. 30 more seconds on how quickly that entire sequence unfolded, because the speed of it is almost as remarkable as the substance. A functioning, if fragile, ceasefire that had technically been in place since mid-June came apart in a matter of days, once the tanker strikes began in early July. By the time Trump posted about Iran's request to continue talks, CBS News described the resulting strikes as the most intense rounds of American action since that original ceasefire had even been agreed to back in June. So this wasn't a slow-motion breakdown playing out over weeks. It was a rapid collapse, tanker attacks, retaliatory strikes, further retaliation, and then a public declaration that the ceasefire itself no longer applied, all compressed into less than a week. Give me 30 seconds here, because I think that single sentence is the entire hinge point of tonight's story. Iran wanted to keep the diplomatic channel open. The United States said, fine, we'll keep talking, but we are no longer bound by any pause in military operations while we do it. That's an incredibly unusual negotiating posture, agreeing to continue a conversation while simultaneously stripping away the one thing that made the previous months of that conversation stable in the first place. It's the diplomatic equivalent of saying, sure, let's keep talking, right after taking your hand off the table. So what did dropping that ceasefire actually look like in practice? According to CNN's live coverage from that same window, the U.S. military said it hit 90 targets along Iran's coastline overnight, all in a single wave. 30 seconds on what that number really represents, because 90 coastal targets in one strike package is an enormous scale of operation. That's not a handful of symbolic hits meant to send a message. That's a systematic sweep along an entire stretch of shoreline. And it lines up almost perfectly with a phrase that's become common in headlines around this exact moment. The idea that Washington was, in effect, deleting Iran's coastline piece by piece. Let's get specific about what actually got hit, because the details here are genuinely striking. CBS News reported that at least 30 fishing boats were destroyed when 2 American projectiles struck the Panj Pelé fishing pier in Bandar Abbas during this exact round of coastal attacks. 30 seconds to sit with that detail, because a fishing pier isn't a military command center or a missile battery. It's where working boats tie up. Whatever the broader military logic behind targeting that specific pier, the visible result was 30 fishing vessels destroyed in a port city that ordinary Iranian fishermen depend on for their livelihood. A detail that tells you just how sweeping and how physically disruptive this particular wave of strikes actually was along the coast. 30 more seconds on why a pier like that might have actually been considered a legitimate military target, despite how it looks on the surface. Fishing piers and small craft harbors along Iran's southern coast have repeatedly come up throughout this war as staging points for exactly the kind of fast attack boats and small drone launches that Iran's naval forces have used to threaten shipping in the strait. A pier that looks, from the outside, like nothing more than a fishing community's working waterfront can, in practice, double as a dispersal point for exactly the kind of small, fast, hard-to-track vessels that make a naval blockade so difficult to enforce cleanly. That doesn't erase the human cost of 30 destroyed boats in a fishing town, but it does help explain why American targeting planners may have considered that specific pier worth including in a 90-target coastal wave rather than an accidental or purely symbolic hit. And Bandar Abbas wasn't the only coastal location hit. CNN reported that U.S. forces struck several locations in Iran's coastal province of Bushehr around midday local time that same Thursday, including, according to a regional official quoted by Iranian state media, the perimeter of a nuclear power plant and a pier used by fishing boats. 30 more seconds on why the words nuclear power plant perimeter should catch your attention here, because Bushehr houses Iran's only operational civilian nuclear power facility, a Russian-built reactor that's been a subject of international scrutiny for years. Striking the perimeter of a facility like that, rather than the core reactor building itself, suggests a deliberate targeting decision. Hit the surrounding military or infrastructure elements without directly risking a nuclear incident. But the sheer proximity of American ordnance landing anywhere near an active nuclear plant is the kind of detail that understandably raises alarm regardless of how carefully the target was chosen. 30 seconds on why that distinction, perimeter versus reactor core, matters so much from a pure safety standpoint, because it's not a small technical footnote worth glossing over quickly. A civilian nuclear power reactor connected to Russian design and construction carries an entirely different risk profile than a military bunker or missile site sitting somewhere out in open desert terrain. Any strike anywhere near an active reactor risks triggering exactly the kind of international alarm that happened after the original Fordo and Natanz strikes back in 2025, when the International Atomic Energy Agency urged restraint specifically to avoid a nuclear accident. Whether or not American planners genuinely avoided the reactor building itself out of caution, or simply because the actual military targets they wanted, radar installations, coastal defense positions, logistics buildings, happened to sit on the plant's perimeter rather than inside its core structure, the optics alone guarantee this specific strike location will keep drawing outsized attention compared to almost anything else hit along that coastline. Here's 30 seconds on how Iran actually responded to all of this, because it wasn't a one-sided beatdown. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said they targeted U.S. military bases in Kuwait and Bahrain in direct response to the coastal strikes. And separately, Iran said it fired 10 ballistic missiles at a U.S. military base in northern Jordan, missiles the Jordanian government confirmed it intercepted after they breached the country's airspace and triggered air raid sirens across the region. So this wasn't Iran simply absorbing a coastal bombardment and staying quiet. It was actively firing back at American positions in 3 separate countries within the same general window, which tells you the ceasefire is over declaration wasn't just rhetoric on the American side either. Both militaries treated it as a genuine return to open hostilities almost immediately. 30 seconds on why Iran chose those 3 specific countries for its response, rather than striking directly at the American mainland or attempting something more dramatic, because the pattern itself is revealing. Kuwait and Bahrain both host significant American military infrastructure within relatively close range of Iranian territory, making them logistically easier retaliatory targets than anything further afield. Jordan, further removed geographically, has nonetheless remained a consistent target throughout this war, specifically because of the American presence there. Choosing all 3 in rapid succession, rather than concentrating fire on just one, spreads the retaliatory message across multiple U.S. partners simultaneously, forcing each of them individually to activate air defenses and absorb at least some of the political and military strain of hosting American forces during an active war, rather than letting any single country bear that burden alone. 30 more seconds on the timing of Trump's own public statements during this exact stretch, because it adds real texture to why the president was in such an unforgiving mood. According to CNN, Trump's decision to move forward with this fresh round of strikes was driven in part by his frustration that the Strait of Hormuz still wasn't fully open, and in part because Iran struck ships transiting the strait specifically while he was attending a NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey. A U.S. official familiar with the discussions told CNN that the timing of Iran's initial strikes particularly irked the president, given they landed while he was in meetings with allied leaders on an entirely different continent. Trump reportedly told reporters directly in Ankara that he considered the ceasefire over, effectively telegraphing the coastal strike wave that followed within days. 30 seconds on why the NATO summit backdrop specifically raised the stakes here, because timing like that carries real diplomatic weight beyond just personal irritation. A sitting American president standing among allied heads of state gets treated as a kind of live demonstration of American credibility and control, and having a foreign adversary choose that exact moment to strike commercial shipping reads, whether intended that way or not, as a direct test of whether Washington's attention elsewhere translates into weaker enforcement back home. Multiple officials quoted across various outlets during this period described the administration's response as being shaped as much by that perceived challenge to American credibility on the world stage as by the tactical military situation in the strait itself. That combination, wounded pride on an international stage plus genuine economic pressure over blocked shipping, is a pretty reliable recipe for an unusually forceful response, and the 90-target coastal wave that followed within days fits that pattern closely. Let's take 30 seconds to zoom out and talk about the broader blockade this entire coastal campaign has been sitting on top of, because the strikes didn't happen in isolation. Back on April 13th, the United States had already imposed a formal naval blockade on Iran, following the collapse of an earlier round of talks known as the Islamabad negotiations. According to tracking on that blockade, CENTCOM reported 85 vessels intercepted, with 3 ships actually seized outright, while Lloyd's List separately estimated that roughly 26 vessels managed to bypass the blockade during that same stretch. U.S. officials have estimated the blockade is costing Iran approximately $500 million a day. Iran, for its part, responded by seizing 2 cargo ships of its own in retaliation. 30 seconds to really absorb that daily cost figure, because $500 million a day, sustained over weeks and months, isn't a minor economic inconvenience. That's the kind of number that starts genuinely straining a national economy. And it's the financial backdrop against which Iran was asking to continue talks in the first place. 30 more seconds on how that blockade actually functions day to day, because it's worth understanding the mechanics behind that huge cost figure. Rather than a single dramatic naval barrier, the blockade operates as a rolling pattern of interceptions, American and Allied naval assets stopping, boarding, and inspecting vessels suspected of carrying Iranian crude or violating sanctions along key approaches to Iranian ports. Every vessel turned away or seized represents lost revenue on cargo that would otherwise have reached international buyers. And the 26 vessels Lloyd's List estimated successfully bypassed the blockade. During that stretch shows the operation was never airtight, but 85 interceptions against only 26 successful evasions still represents a fairly effective chokehold on Iran's ability to move oil freely, which goes a long way toward explaining exactly how a daily cost figure that large actually accumulates in practice. Now here's 30 seconds on why I think Iran actually reached out for continued talks at that specific moment, rather than simply doubling down militarily. You've got a blockade costing the country $500 million a day, a Strait of Hormuz that Trump was publicly refusing to accept as closed, and an American administration that had just watched its NATO summit get overshadowed by fresh Iranian strikes on shipping. From Tehran's side, reopening a diplomatic channel, even a shaky one, at least creates the possibility of slowing the bleeding on the economic front, even if it comes without the protection of an actual pause in hostilities. That's a government trying to buy itself some room to breathe financially, even while continuing to trade strikes militarily. 30 more seconds on how this specific round of escalation connected to an earlier moment that same week, because there's a piece of context that's easy to miss if you're only looking at the coastal strikes in isolation. CNN reported that just one day earlier, on July 8th, U.S. forces had also struck a railway bridge in Akala in northeastern Iran, near the border with Turkmenistan, a target roughly 900 miles away from the Strait of Hormuz itself. CENTCOM's own statement that day described hitting 90 Iranian military targets along the coastlines, but notably didn't mention the bridge specifically, according to CNN's reporting. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it shows the target set wasn't purely confined to the coast, even during a period defined publicly as a coastal campaign. Infrastructure deep in the Iranian interior, far from any strait or shipping lane, was also getting hit during this same stretch, even if it wasn't the headline focus of the official CENTCOM statement. Let's spend 30 seconds on the political backdrop inside Iran during this exact window too, because it wasn't just a military story unfolding in isolation. This entire round of escalation happened just as Iran was burying its late supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, following days of funeral proceedings. According to CNN's coverage, one figure was notably absent from those funeral events: Khamenei's own son and the newly installed supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. CNN also reported that funeral proceedings featured explicit calls for revenge against Trump personally. So you had a country simultaneously managing a supreme leadership transition, burying its former head of state, absorbing a coastal bombing campaign, and asking to keep a diplomatic channel open, all within the same handful of days. That's an enormous amount of institutional and political strain concentrated into one narrow window. 30 more seconds on why a leadership transition happening in the middle of all this matters so much strategically, because it's easy to treat as a side note when it's actually central to understanding Iran's behavior during this exact stretch. A brand new supreme leader, stepping into the role his own father held for decades, inherits both the authority and the expectations that come with it, including, apparently, public calls for revenge, voiced at his predecessor's own funeral. That's an extraordinarily difficult political environment in which to simultaneously request continued talks with the country actively bombing your coastline. Any visible softness toward Washington during exactly this moment risks being read domestically as weakness from a leader who hasn't yet had time to establish his own authority, which likely helps explain why Iran kept firing back militarily even while its diplomats worked the mediation channel through Qatar and Pakistan behind the scenes. 30 seconds on the Lebanon angle running underneath all of this, because it's part of why the original Memorandum of Understanding was so fragile to begin with. That June agreement had called for an end to hostilities on every front, explicitly including Lebanon, and Tehran had consistently argued that continued Israeli operations against Hezbollah inside Lebanese territory constituted a direct violation of that broader deal. Israel and Hezbollah, for their part, kept trading lower-level strikes throughout this period despite their own separate ceasefire arrangement. each side justifying its actions as a response to the other's violations. That unresolved Lebanon front gave Tehran a ready-made grievance to point to whenever critics asked why it kept attacking shipping and Gulf bases despite having signed a ceasefire in the first place. 30 more seconds on why that Lebanon grievance carried real weight rather than functioning purely as a convenient talking point, because there's a genuine legal and political logic underneath it. The June memorandum was explicitly written to cover every front simultaneously, not just the direct U.S. Iran military relationship, which means Tehran had a defensible argument that any continued Israeli action against Hezbollah, regardless of how limited, technically broke the same document Washington was accusing Iran of violating through its own strikes on shipping. Whether or not you find that argument persuasive as a matter of who actually broke the ceasefire first, it gave Iranian officials a coherent public justification to offer both domestically and to mediators like Qatar and Pakistan, framing Tehran's own continued strikes as a response to an unaddressed violation, rather than as the original trigger for the whole breakdown. Let's fast forward now to how this played out over the following days, because the coastal campaign didn't stop after that first 90-target wave. According to CNN's coverage from July the 20th, the U.S. completed yet another round of strikes against Iran, this time explicitly framed as retribution after President Trump warned that Tehran would pay for the deaths of 3 American service members over the preceding days. Iranian state media reported explosions in multiple locations, and a U.S. official said the military was increasing the number of fighter jets deployed to the Middle East as the president weighed how to proceed further. 30 more seconds on a detail from that same report worth remembering, because it's easy to lose amid the bigger strategic headlines. CNN noted that dozens of American refueling tankers had arrived in Israel in recent days, with more still incoming. Exactly the kind of infrastructure buildup that lets a sustained long-range strike campaign keep running night after night without losing tempo. 30 seconds on why that specific combination, more fighter jets plus more refueling tankers arriving simultaneously, tells you something important about how the campaign was expected to evolve from that point forward. Fighter jets alone give you presence and the ability to respond quickly to emerging threats, but without expanded aerial refueling capacity, their operational range and the tempo at which they can sustain repeated sorties stays limited. Building out the tanker infrastructure in Israel at the same moment additional fighters were arriving elsewhere in the region reads as preparation for a longer, more sustained campaign rather than a short, one-off retaliatory burst. That's consistent with everything else we've traced tonight, a war that kept finding new ways to intensify rather than settle into any kind of stable holding pattern. Here's 30 seconds on the specific locations named in that July 20th update, because the coastal theme continued running straight through it. Iranian media reported explosions heard in Bandar Abbas on Qeshm Island and in the Bamani district, all sitting along the Gulf of Oman near the Strait of Hormuz in Iran's southern Hormozgan province. Bandar Abbas, the same city where that fishing pier had already been struck days earlier, was getting hit again. That's not a scattershot campaign moving randomly across the map. That's a sustained, repeated focus on the exact stretch of coastline that controls access to the strait night after night, wave after wave. 30 seconds on the human cost sitting underneath all of this, because it's easy to get lost purely in the geography and the target counts. The Pentagon confirmed that nearly 100 American service members had suffered some level of injury, mostly minor, since July 7th alone, and CNN separately reported that the military had been notably slow to disclose the scope of those injuries as the conflict unfolded. On the diplomatic side, mediators were reportedly floating a 10-day ceasefire proposal even as these strikes continued, a reminder that the fighting and the negotiating were running on completely separate, overlapping tracks, rather than one waiting politely for the other to finish. Let's spend 30 seconds on Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan specifically, because all 3 kept absorbing spillover from this coastal campaign throughout the period we're covering tonight. Kuwait intercepted what officials described as hostile targets on multiple occasions. Sirens sounded across Bahrain as air defenses activated, and Jordan reported downing Iranian missiles on more than one separate occasion during this same stretch. None of these 3 countries were the primary combatants in this specific fight, yet all 3 kept absorbing direct military risk simply by hosting American forces or sitting along the geography Iran was choosing to retaliate through. 30 more seconds on why that pattern of spillover matters, for understanding the shape of this entire war, not just this one coastal episode. Every time Iran chooses to answer an American coastal strike by hitting a base in Kuwait or Bahrain rather than attempting anything against the American mainland or Israel directly, it's making a calculated decision about escalation control, punishing Washington's regional footprint without crossing into territory that would almost certainly trigger an even more severe response. That's been a remarkably consistent pattern throughout this entire conflict. Retaliation calibrated to hit American interests, specifically in the Gulf states hosting U.S. forces, rather than anything that risks pulling in a broader, less controllable escalation. It's a strategy that keeps the war contained geographically, even as its intensity keeps climbing within that contained space. Let's spend one more 30 seconds before moving into the closing thoughts, because there's a detail about the broader mediation effort worth including here. Regional sources told CNN that Pakistan and Qatar were both actively working, in parallel, to bring the two countries back to a more formal negotiating table, even as this coastal campaign was unfolding. A detail that shows the diplomatic track wasn't purely reactive to Trump's own statements, but involved genuine ongoing outside effort from two separate governments trying to keep some version of a peace process alive throughout the entire episode. Now let's move into the strategic analysis, because I think this is where the individual pieces of tonight's story actually connect into one coherent picture. What you're looking at here is a genuinely rare real-time example of a government trying to negotiate and fight at full intensity simultaneously, rather than treating those as sequential phases. Iran asked to keep talking specifically because the financial pressure of the blockade, roughly $500 million a day, had become unsustainable to simply ignore. But asking to keep talking didn't mean asking to stop fighting. And the United States made that distinction explicit and public within the same breath. It agreed to continued dialogue. 30 more seconds on why that specific combination, active diplomacy, running directly alongside active bombing, is so unusual even by the standards of this particular war. Every previous ceasefire attempt we've tracked throughout this conflict, the April truce, the June Memorandum of Understanding, collapsed, and then diplomacy essentially paused while both sides re-escalated militarily before eventually finding their way back to some kind of negotiating table. This time, according to Trump's own public statement, there wasn't even a pause. The talks and the strikes ran on parallel tracks from the very same Friday afternoon, which suggests both governments have started treating negotiation itself as just another form of pressure, rather than a genuine off-ramp from the fighting. 30 seconds on what that shift potentially signals for every future round of talks between these two countries going forward, because it's a meaningful precedent once it's been set. If both sides have effectively demonstrated that a diplomatic channel can stay open even while active strikes continue, that removes one of the traditional incentives either government would normally have to actually pause fighting in order to protect an ongoing negotiation. Once you've proven a war and a peace process can run in parallel without either one forcing the other to stop, there's less structural pressure on either side to actually convert talks into a real, binding ceasefire, since the diplomatic channel no longer requires that pause to survive in the first place. 30 seconds on what the coastal targeting pattern specifically tells you about American strategy during this window, because I don't think it was chosen randomly. Hitting the Strait of Hormuz facing coastline, Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, Qeshm, repeatedly and heavily, goes directly after the exact geography Iran has used throughout this entire war to threaten commercial shipping and pressure the global oil market. It's not primarily about symbolism, it's about physically degrading the infrastructure, the piers, the coastal military positions, the logistics nodes that Iran depends on to keep contesting control of that waterway in the first place. Every fishing pier or coastal facility taken offline is one fewer platform Iran can use to stage the exact kind of drone and fast boat attacks that have defined so much of this war's naval dimension. Here's 30 seconds on where I think this leaves Tehran strategically, because it's a genuinely difficult position to be in. Continue fighting at full intensity, and the blockade keeps draining roughly $500 million a day while the coastline keeps absorbing strikes night after night. Pull back and accept a real ceasefire on American terms, and it risks looking like capitulation to a domestic audience that just buried a supreme leader amid public calls for revenge against the American president. Keep talking whilst also keep fighting, which is essentially the path Iran chose here, and you get exactly what we've watched play out: continued financial bleeding, continued coastal destruction, and a diplomatic channel that exists mostly to manage the war's temperature rather than actually end it. So here's where I want to leave this with you tonight. Given everything we just walked through, the Bandar Abbas fishing pier, the Bushehr nuclear plant perimeter, the 90-target coastal wave, the $500 million daily blockade cost, do you think Iran's request to continue talking was a genuine attempt to find an off-ramp? Or was it purely a tactical move to buy time while the leadership transition around the new supreme leader settled into place? And do you think a real ceasefire, one that actually pauses the fighting rather than just keeping a conversation technically open, is possible while both sides keep treating negotiation and bombardment as running on the exact same track? I'd genuinely like to hear where you land on that, because I think reasonable people can read Iran's specific choice here in very different ways, depending on how much weight you put on the financial pressure versus the political optics back home. 30 seconds on one more angle worth weighing before we close, because I think it's genuinely the hardest part of this entire story to call with any confidence. Every government involved here, Washington, Tehran, and the mediators in Doha and Islamabad, has strong incentives to keep some version of talks alive, regardless of what's happening militarily, simply because a total diplomatic collapse removes any remaining path toward eventually ending this war. That means the conversation itself might keep limping along almost indefinitely, propped up more by the absence of a better alternative than by any real progress toward an actual resolution, while the coastal strikes and the retaliatory missiles keep running underneath it on their own separate, largely unaffected schedule. And that dynamic, a diplomatic channel surviving, mainly because nobody wants to be blamed for closing it, rather than because it's producing genuine results, is worth remembering the next time a headline announces renewed talks between these two countries. The existence of a conversation happening in Doha or Islamabad tells you very little on its own about whether the fighting on the ground is actually about to change. One last 30-second thought before wrapping up completely, because I think it ties everything together. A ceasefire that gets declared over in the same breath it gets extended isn't really a ceasefire in any traditional sense anymore. It's become a label both governments apply selectively, useful for managing public messaging and keeping a mediator like Qatar or Pakistan engaged, but no longer functioning as an actual constraint on military operations for either side. That's the real story sitting underneath tonight's headline. Not that Iran asked for talks and got bombed anyway, but that both words, ceasefire and negotiation, have quietly stopped meaning what they used to mean throughout this entire war, and that shift alone may end up shaping how every future round of this same conflict gets negotiated from here forward. Thanks so much for spending this time working carefully through it with me tonight, thinking through every piece of this together rather than just skimming the headlines. I'll keep tracking whatever comes out of Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, and the broader coastline over the next several days. And the moment there's real movement on that 10-day ceasefire proposal mediators have been floating, or any confirmation of further coastal strikes, I'll break it all down for you in just as much detail as we covered tonight. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you again very soon. If you want the quickest way to keep pace with this specific thread going forward, the numbers worth watching closest are the daily blockade cost estimates, the weekly tally of coastal targets CENTCOM confirms, and whether that 10-day ceasefire proposal actually produces a defined start date rather than staying an open-ended item mediators keep floating without resolution. Those three signals, more than any single dramatic headline, tend to tell you which direction this specific chapter of the war is actually heading next, and they're usually available well before any official statement catches up to explain what's already happened.